Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good night's sleep because we have a long day ahead of us. We are working against a tight schedule, especially that we would like to get as much as people involved across to Lebanon and in the region because, as you know, the time difference, people are watching us. Yesterday, we had a good audience. We had around 100 people, and today we expect that we'll have more people attend. Basically, also, we'll try to integrate as much questions as we could through Coco and the team. And we are starting our day with a very interesting and somewhat, to some, is a controversial issue. However, it is part of our work on the Druze and part of what we call being a Druze in a way. So today's talk by two very talented young scholars, and the title of the session is called Druze Generational Bonds Across Space and Boundaries. We have two speakers. We have Natalie, which will be talking about Druze afterlives between bodies and borders. And we have Malek Rasamny, who will be talking about reincarnation among the Druze of Lebanon and global diaspora, communal memory, imagined kinship, and discursive battleground. We will start with our dear Natalie, a brief bio. Natalie El-Eid is a PhD candidate in English at Syracuse University, a first-generation Lebanese-American Druze woman. Natalie works and transforms from within a U.S. landscape, but identifies Beirut as her heart and home, like most of us. Natalie received her undergraduate education in psychology at the American University of Beirut and Central Connecticut State University. She completed her master's degree in English at SUNY Cortland. Her research interests and work centers on traditional Arab word memory, trauma, gender, and sexuality. With this, I would like to leave the floor to Natalie, and then we can move on to Malek and the Q&A. Tfaddali.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you all today to share my talk titled Druze Afterlives Between Bodies and Borders, in person and online. Thank you for being here. Before I begin, I would also like to thank the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, the Department of History and Archeology at the American University of Beirut, and the American Druze Foundation for all of the time and effort that has been put into organizing this wonderful and much-needed space, in which scholars may connect with one another and others around the world, invested in learning and sharing knowledges on transnational Druze communities. These critical knowledges, I always assert in my work, are not simply additive. As a Druze scholar, I never want to ask, but what about the Druze? Rather, I want to ask what happens when we center the Druze across academic disciplines and fields of thought. I believe and I hope my work provides a small but earnest example of one way that centering the Druze in academic scholarship does not simply add to, but transforms how we see Arab cultures, peoples, histories, and futures, both within the Arab world and across our adopted homelands. Though conferences like this may make evident an ongoing and important growth in Druze studies, the unique cultural and religious Druze population is widely considered esoteric by Druze and non-Druze alike. As many in this room know, Druze religion and culture remains frequently associated with secrecy and mystery. This unknowability has led to the long-standing rootedness of the Druze within Orientalist and Neo-Orientalist thought and theory. What seems to inarguably exacerbate these notions of unknowingness in relation to the Druze is the fact that, towards the non-Druze, members of the Druze community enact a strict secrecy about their religion across transnational Druze communities. Moreover, Druze members, especially those living in diaspora, or what we may here refer to as adopted homelands, themselves often have limited understandings of the tenets and beliefs of the Druze religion. Part of these limited understandings, as was noted in yesterday's talks, is undeniably a lack of official Druze archives. However, I also want to stress the importance of who is creating these archives, particularly when it comes to marginalized voices within and beyond the Arab world. Whose voices are getting heard and whose are overlooked. There is, I continuously find in my work, a strong yet often invisibilized Druze archive being contributed to every day by Druze scholars, artists, activists, and people. My dissertation project, which engages with contemporary Druze cultural productions, such as novels, documentaries, and online cultures, thus aims to amplify Druze voices who are not always given a platform and work in collaboration with them. So when I began my dissertation research, I put out a call for Druze participants who were willing to speak to me about their lived experiences and stories, particularly surrounding the Druze belief in reincarnation. The overwhelming response I received from our community speaks to our interconnectivity, generosity, and support for one another across time and space, which leads me to our discussion today. This talk considers the impacts and interventions across the fields of transnational Arab memory and trauma studies that come to the forefront when studying the phenomenon of Druze reincarnation. In exploring what I refer to as Druze afterlives, I argue that stories of Druze reincarnation demand scholars reconsider the ways that diaspora, trauma, memory, and their eternal specters are both contended with and relived in the transnational Arab world. In doing so, I ask, how does reincarnation forge intimate and necessary interconnections between Druze peoples within and across their adopted homelands? Considering their relatively small population size and widely diasporic nature, in what ways are these interconnections critical to the survival of Druze religion and culture? Moreover, how do transnational Druze peoples, despite specters of trauma and memory, continue to practice alternative ways of healing, remembering, and connecting across bodies, borders, and lives within and beyond the Arab world? In my conceptualization of Druze afterlives, I am deeply influenced by Ghostly Matters, a critical masterpiece on the ongoing ramifications of state violence, in which sociologist Avery Gordon argues that, and I quote, "Haunting raises specters, and it alters the experience of being in time, the way that we separate the past, the present, and the future. These specters or ghosts appear when the trouble they represent and symptomize is no longer being contained or repressed or blocked from view. The ghost, as I understand it, is not the invisible or some ineffable excess. The whole essence, if you can use that word, of a ghost is that it has a real presence and it demands its due, your attention," end quote. In considering the many specters or ghosts that continue to haunt the transnational Arab world, for this talk, I would like to focus on the Lebanese Civil War, which I argue holds a particularly unique positionality in terms of what Gordon states can no longer be contained or repressed or blocked from view. Indeed, the Lebanese state has played a notorious and active role in shoving the horrors of its 15-year-long civil war under the blanket of an ongoing national and cultural amnesia. As political scientist Soon Hogbal describes in his book, War and Memory in Lebanon, from the war's end in 1990, quote, "Lebanese officialdom discouraged critical memorialization and instead promoted a culture of letting bygones be bygones. In the absence of state-sponsored attempts to establish what happened in the Lebanese Civil War and who was to blame for the human tragedies that accompanied it, the politics of remembering in post-war Lebanon emerged mainly through cultural production, which, by various non-state actors, disputed the ethical, political, and historical meaning of the Civil War," end quote. So this debate continues today and has been kind of increasingly important given the rise of militarization, politicization, and globalization of our contemporary world more broadly, the Arab world in particular, and the state of ongoing crises in Lebanon. I believe shifting the lens to the Druze, often relegated to the margins in these ongoing debates, provides an alternative way of understanding and remembering the violences of events such as the Lebanese Civil War, as well as their eternal specters. If we are to understand historical and contemporary Lebanon as what Lebanese historian Kamal Salibi aptly described as, quote, "a house of many mansions," and follow Druze leader Walid Jumblat's assertion that the civil war in Lebanon was, quote, "a way to determine the correct history of the country," I argue that the Lebanese Civil War, following Gordon's theorization of haunting, continues to affect not only how Lebanese do or do not separate the past, the present, and the future, but also how these traumas move across borders and spaces, both for those living in Lebanon and for the approximately 1 million who, as a result of the war, became part of its global diaspora. I introduced the term Druze afterlives to examine the ongoing hauntings of trauma such as the Lebanese Civil War, specifically the interconnections and collapses between time and space that were engendered and, importantly, carried as a result of these violences. And the Druze carry these traumas in a critically unique way. I've spent the better part of the past 2 years speaking with reincarnated Druze peoples in the US and Lebanon, those who remember and speak to their reincarnation stories. What became immediately evident in these conversations is that many Druze who remember their past lives had died in traumatic and/or violent ways. Contemporary trauma or memory studies are deeply concerned with the ways in which traumatic experience affects human lives. And one of the most widely known contemporary texts of trauma studies, a #1 New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, Basil van der Kolk charts new and revolutionary ways of understanding the complex effects of psychological trauma on the mind and body, from the ways in which survivors contend with emotions, decision-making, and social relationships, to the ways that traumatic experience biologically rewires the neurological processes of the human brain. In studying how transnational Druze communities contend with and carry trauma, however, I posit a new mode of understanding the impacts of traumatic experience is necessitated, one that expands the mind and body dynamic that van der Kolk theorizes and into the triangulation of the human body, mind, and importantly, soul. Central to my conceptualization of what I call Druze afterlives is thus the Druze belief in reincarnation, or transmigration of the soul, a belief that I argue has long served as a critical point of interconnectivity for transnational Druze communities across bodies, borders, and of course, lives. Here, it is important to underscore that this research is not intended to prove or disprove the phenomenon of reincarnation. Rather, I want to look at the significant impacts and implications of the Druze belief in reincarnation on political, cultural, and societal levels within and beyond Druze communities. In doing so, here I turn to the testimony and work of Basil Abi Shaheen, a reincarnated Lebanese Druze historian and the author of the 2019 text, The People's Liberation Army, Through the Eyes of a Lens, 1976 to 1991. I first heard of Basil 2 years ago, when a friend in Lebanon who knew I was holding interviews with reincarnated Druze peoples told me, you know, we, the Druze, hear so many stories. There are so many people, but my husband has a cousin named Basil. He remembers a lot and he's spoken about it publicly. You should check him out. Now, the truth of my friend's words here deserves to be underscored. Even as a Druze woman born and raised in the US, I always had a deep awareness of the importance of reincarnation to Druze communities, both in my homeland of Lebanon and in my home state in the US. As I grew older, I became more and more cognizant of how widespread the Druze belief in reincarnation is and how many reincarnation stories surround Druze families, no matter where in the world they live. For many Druze, these stories are a part of everyday life and conversation, as common as the seemingly distant but always already existent interconnections continually being discovered between Druze peoples. Which takes me back to my friend's husband's cousin, Basil. In this life, Basil was born in Kuwait in 1987. He now lives between Toronto and Beirut. However, in his past life, Basif remembers himself as Yusuf al-Jawhari, a 16-year-old boy fatally wounded by shelling in the Druze town of Alay during the Lebanese Civil War. Here we see the only picture of Yusuf that exists today, which is part of Basil's private collection exhibited in the 2019 documentary, Once Removed. Despite his young age, Yusuf was a soldier in the People's Liberation Army, a primarily Druze militia founded at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War and disbanded soon after the war's conclusion. During the war, the PLA was the militia of the Progressive Socialist Party, PSP, which was a political sect founded by the prominent Druze historical figure and leader Kemal Jumblat. The PSP remains a major political player in Lebanon today, regionally based in the Druze stronghold of the Shuf and now headed by Walid Jumblat. Despite the fact that the PLA was one of the largest and well-organized sectarian militias of the time, little has been written about the role of the PLA during the Lebanese Civil War. Swept into the larger cultural amnesia of the Lebanese Civil War, it is all too easy to forget the many players imbricated in Lebanon's complex histories, both nationally and across its easily permeated borders. However, Basil's reincarnation testimony and life work intervene in these notions of forgetting, breaking silences, borders, and boundaries of past and present. As a historian, in 2019, Basil culminated a 10-year-long process of tedious collecting and archiving with the publication of his photography book project, The People's Liberation Army Through the Eyes of a Lens. To date, the largest collection of memorabilia in the world on the role of the PLA in the Lebanese Civil War. With this book, Basil not only intervenes into the long silences enacted by the Lebanese state in relation to the Lebanese Civil War more broadly, but centers the Druze, often pushed to the margins of the war's already silenced histories. However, in correlation with the historical interventions of Basil's book project are the ways in which it also breaks another critical silence, that of the grave, giving voice once again to Yusuf al-Jawhari, one of the estimated 100,000 dead or disappeared who until today remain blanketed in the traumas of the war and its aftermath. As Dr. Shawki Hamadi notes in this book's preface, quote, "It is as if Yusuf's soul has brought back to life the dust of his old battles that have crossed time zones, to tell war stories and to exhibit all the faded facts from the past." In the crossing of time zones described in this quote, we see a collapse of time that is uniquely enabled by the specters of Druze afterlives, here Yusuf's, an active force that, as Hamadi describes, has brought to life the dust of his old battles. For Basil, formerly Yusuf, these afterlives continue to shape his present lived experiences. As Basil himself writes in his book's introduction, "Although in my current life I have never been in a battlefield, fired a gun, or experienced the hardships of the Lebanese Civil War, yet the images of the PSP's and PLA's heroic moments have remained vividly in my thoughts and imagination since my early years. This fine, drawn, yet strong sense of belonging to a community I have never actually lived in created the urge and motivation in me to seek and search for facts capable of capturing my flashbacks and unexplainable memories." Basil's words here make evident that ongoing effects or afterlives not only of the war, but of being Druze, an identity which allows Basil to forge interconnections across time as he negotiates specters of fierce belonging to a community he has never actually lived in, here the PLA. Druze afterlives, as I see them, thus function on deeply individual and personal levels, but also operate on a much larger collective front. As voices from beyond the grave, they speak to and break the long silences shrouding the Lebanese Civil War, making evident the unique role that Druze can and do hold in bearing witness and testifying to these hidden histories on a national level. As Basil's case exemplifies, Druze afterlives forge interconnections between the individual and the collective across time. However, they also transcend the borders of nation and state. Though Basil was born in Kuwait in 1987 and currently lives between Canada and Lebanon, the earliest occurrence of Basil's past life memories was triggered by his 1991 visit to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which is not far from where we are gathering here today. This trip to the US had a transformative impact on Basil, who was only 5 years old at the time. So here we have a picture of Basil that was taken during this trip, in which he was particularly struck by the three soldiers statue seen in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He would repeatedly draw these three soldiers from this day until he was a teenager. So here is one of those drawings. Several of these drawings, which I have screenshotted for the purpose of this presentation, are shared in the 2019 audiovisual documentary Once Removed, in which transnational Druze artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan holds a conversation with Basil while exhibiting some of the pictures from Basil's archive. So just as an aside here, Lawrence Abu Hamdan's work is also currently being featured at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. If anyone is in the area, I'm sure it is well worth the trip. But in this slide, we see one of the drawings of the three soldiers' statues that Basil created as a child. Interestingly, when Abu Hamdan asks Basil what it was about this statue that triggered his flashbacks, Basil responds with, quote, "Just the three fellow comrades." Basil, even as a young child, thus feels a strong sense of camaraderie and fellowship with these soldiers, an interconnection through war that is felt across the borders of time and space. Indeed, when Abu Hamdan asks Basil if it mattered that these soldiers were from a totally different time, Basil responds with a firm no. No, it didn't matter. They were just three soldiers who died together. The trauma that Basil carries, having lived through the Lebanese civil war in a past life, thus engenders a collapse of time and even nation for Basil, who sees these American soldiers, despite the different contexts and spaces of the Lebanese civil war to the Vietnam War, as inherently interrelated. Moreover, it is important to remember that the US played a critical part in both of these wars. The tens of drawings that Basil created from the time he was 5 to the time he was 13 all speak to these collapses of time and space via the specters of traumatic experience. So in this drawing, we see a US military graveyard, very close in resemblance to that of Arlington, the tombstones drawn onto a green lawn, many of which you may note are adorned with crosses. But here Basil has drawn Dar al-Taifi in the background, the religious hall for the Druze located in Beirut. He was 9 when he created this drawing. Next to this drawing, we see another drawing of Basil's, which shows a US-style military graveyard fused with symbols and traces of Lebanon, such as the Lebanese flag. As Basil repeatedly began drawing these memorials of the Lebanese Civil War, but in the style of war memorials to the US, what becomes evident, I suggest here, is both the ways that these wars interconnect survivors of traumatic experience, as well as how the realities of these wars and their specters continuously work across and even collapse time and space. Importantly, these drawings also indicate Basil's inherent need to memorialize a war otherwise erased or forgotten. Testimonies such as Basil's can, I argue, shape the way that war is not remembered. For example, in this slide, we see Basil and Abu Hamdan standing in front of a picture of Basil as a young child, or a drawing that he made as a young child of his own tombstone. However, it is juxtaposed with a picture of Basil in front of a real-life Civil War memorial in Malek. Importantly, this real-life memorial contains a lot of false information. As Basil points out, not only is the date in which Yusuf al-Jawhari was killed listed on this memorial incorrectly, but the memorial gets many dates and even names of the fallen wrong. With these drawings and with his reincarnation story, Basil and others like him are thus not only breaking historical silences, but critically rewriting the memorialization of such events. These testimonies and effect of what I call Druze afterlives are thus distinctly transformative, but also necessary. They are an imperative to testify, to tell, or to speak. In one of the foundational texts of trauma studies, Testimony, psychologist Dori Laub calls the critical act of testifying to one's trauma for Holocaust survivors the imperative to tell. For Lob, telling one story becomes inherently linked to a survivor's ability to actually survive, as not telling here is linked to a perpetuation of the trauma's tyranny. Left unspoken, these traumatic events, Lob argues, continue to, quote, pervasively invade and contaminate the survivor's daily life. Interestingly, reincarnated Druze are referred to in Arabic as the Notqin. Though the term has no true English equivalent, the closest translation of the term nataq from Arabic means to talk or to speak. And indeed, reincarnated Druze people, even at very young ages, seem to feel a distinct need to tell their stories. Many of the reincarnated Druze people I have talked to share with me that they began talking in the sense of nataq at a very young age and were very eager to speak. They would speak of their reincarnation stories to their families, neighbors, friends, anybody who would listen. So much so that their families would often wonder how to get them to shut up. To talk or to tell here, I contend, is an important critical framework through which to study and understand the uniqueness of Druze reincarnation testimonies, their imperative to tell, and its link to survival. I believe that the imperative to tell for the Druze is an imperative to survive on multiple levels. The first, I argue, is the survival of a past life via transmigration of the soul and articulation of often traumatic memories. Not telling for the Druze can not only lead to a festering of that trauma, but also keeps the past life and the stories that they are testifying to in a literal space of death and silence. Therefore, reincarnation stories become critical for survival, but also for healing. This healing can occur on an individual level. So for example, here's a picture of Basil in his present life, taken with his past life father, Fuad. When asked how he felt upon meeting his past life father and family, Basil said one word: relief. However, reincarnation testimonies are critical for the Druze as a collective, working towards cultural connection and survival in a shifting transnational geopolitical landscape. Druze reincarnation stories travel. It is hard to find a Druze person who has not heard at least one story about another Druze being reincarnated. In fact, these stories frequently serve as a way to connect Druze across time and space. It is not uncommon, when hearing someone in their family speak of a past life, for Druze families to trace their loved one to their past life family. I've spoken to reincarnated Druze peoples who have developed close, loving, intimate relationships to their past life families in their current lives, for some even serving in the familial role they once inhabited in their past life. For example, I know one Druze woman who in her present life is younger than her past life children. However, in ways that she finds funny but also often annoying, she is also called upon to mother her past life children. Therefore, not only do Druze reincarnation stories become collective and cultural acts that circulate around transnational Druze communities, but these testimonies can and have worked to reconnect Druze with other Druze across different spaces and times. Considering the limited numbers of the transnational and diasporic Druze community, these reconnections can and do become crucial to individual, collective, and cultural survival. Today, many Druze across the world live in diaspora. And for so many, the goal and the hope is that they continue to carry with them Druze histories and traditions, stories, and memories. Therefore, though trauma plays an important role in my conceptualization of Druze afterlives, so does healing. Druze afterlives thus not only interconnect nations and histories, pasts and presents, but can also speak to and shape Druze futures, the ways in which we continue to find, connect, and relate to one another, no matter where we may migrate, or in this sense, where our souls may transmigrate. After all, in a claim I often hear when talking to other Druze, in a distinctly unique, unorthodox, yet ultimately beautiful way, we are all one big family. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Just a quick story. When Basil was visiting me at my office in Ashrafiyeh, I had my colleague next to me who was Greek Orthodox. and he overheard Basil. When I asked him, why are you interested in the civil war? He told me, ana natiq. So Ciso wanted to know what nutq is, and Ciso is trying till this day to decipher what experience he had with Basil. With this, I will leave the floor to our next speaker, Malek Rasamny, who will also be bringing in Basil for a number of reasons, basically because Basil is a member of the Druze diaspora. However, his research, Malek's research, focuses on reincarnation in general, as well as the role of reincarnation in creating collective memory. This is something that I have worked on in my book, where I have interviewed people who have died in 1958 and they have fought in 1982, and for them, this is a continuous cycle, to the extent that I have testimonies from them relating how they died and how someone who had died fighting with Jumlats was born in a Yazbaki household, and he went crazy because he couldn't relate to his present life. So with this, I would leave the floor to Malek. Malek is a documentary filmmaker, researcher, and social anthropologist. Malek, along with the collaborator Matt Peterson, previous multimedia research project, The Native and the Refugee, explored the juxtaposition of Palestinian refugee camps in the Middle East and American Indian reservations in the United States, and resulted in the feature film Spaces of Exceptions. Malek joined us as a participant, as an attendee in the 2018 conference. However, now his project is fully developed, and he will be sharing some of his research with us. Tfaddal, Malek.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today, and I want to thank Dr. Rabah for inviting me. It was really great to be at the previous conference in AUB, and now I'm really happy to be here in the capacity of a speaker. And I'm glad to see many people I know from the first conference, and since to see you here in a different context in the United States as opposed to in Lebanon. So my master's degree work and my PhD work has really been focused on the issue of reincarnation within the Druze community. And what I try to work on and demonstrate but also explore is the ways in which reincarnation is a touchstone or a focal point for Druze religiosity, especially the religiosity of the uninitiated. So for me, reincarnation discursively, experientially, and as a socio-political force even, is a key thing that is a key touchstone for religious experience and identity amongst the uninitiated in particular. So my research explores this idea along three axes. The first axis is reincarnation as a discourse, i.e. what different Druze actors, that could be uninitiated scholars, which I'll discuss more soon, the so-called mshayikh, or the initiated, say or write, and also what people believe about reincarnation, which is to say whether or not it is possible for someone to remember their past life, because this is obviously a subject of debate within the community, the intellectual, philosophical, or religious context in which they place reincarnation, how important or central reincarnation is. So I attempt to read these debates as basically part of a larger debate about the nature of Druze identity in the 20th and 21st century. So I don't assert that there is a single Druze view on reincarnation. I don't believe there is, and even if there was, it would not be my role to be the representative of that view. Rather, I attempt to look at the different silences, emphases, and controversies around reincarnation as a window into a larger kind of debate. That's the first axis of my research. Now, while the first axis of my research is largely based around reincarnation as a discourse, my second axis and my third axis deal with the experience of the Natin, the people who remember their past lives. The second axis looks at reincarnation as a kind of communal phenomenon. So what I attempt to do is kind of find an appropriate, or several appropriate, kind of theoretical frameworks or anthropological frameworks to examine how reincarnation works. And I think here I depart from previous literature in that I don't adopt a functionalist lens, which is to say I don't believe reincarnation is there because it serves a distinct, clearly legible purpose. I think I try to examine reincarnation as part of a life world, which is to say a means through which people perceive reality, a means through which people negotiate and perceive reality. And so within that, I try to look at the role of children in reincarnation. I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of reading in Druze culture, there's a kind of, you could argue, a respect for children or an attempt to read sense into what we would call the noise of children, and I think that's how a lot of experiences of nutuk begin. I also attempt to look at it as a kind of a ritual, albeit an informal ritual, a kind of improvised informal ritual, what I would call almost a ritual of the profane, which is to say a ritual that is not, that brings sacredness into profane things. So that's all within the second axis of my research, which is more anthropological in that sense, classically anthropological. The third axis kind of deals with what my two colleagues were talking about, which is the Civil War. So I look at reincarnation as a force that structures communal memory and influences Druze as well as sectarian identity, if we can distinguish those two things, in relationship to the Lebanese Civil War. And in both cases, my fieldwork is really based on interviews with people who remember their past lives, particularly in the third axis, people who perceive that in their past life, they are, today in fact, they are the reincarnation of dead soldiers or civilians who died during the war. And I've made interviews with many people, and one of the people that I've gotten to know the best is Basil. And I've followed him around, and with him it's more than just interviews, it's kind of participant observation. He's a close friend of mine, and I spend a lot of time with him as he attempts to do his research, which is very interesting. And as he attempts to kind of challenge the PSP in terms of their relationship to martyrs, as he attempts to speak to different people about his relationship with the war. I've been with him and his previous family, with him and his previous commander. It's also interesting when he goes to other communities, non-Druze communities, and speaks about his time as a Nate, as kind of Makram was saying. I've been with him as he's met people from different Shia and Christian political parties, and as he is attempting to get photos of martyrs. And they say, oh, why do you want these photos of martyrs? And he says, well, I'm a martyr myself. And so to see that kind of, to be in the room is quite interesting. But today, what I wanted to do, I'm going to alter it slightly on the fly, but what I wanted to do is highlight two sections of my research that touch on the idea of the diaspora. So in the first section of my research, which remains unchanged, I'm going to speak about the role of the Druze uninitiated in the 20th and 21st century in defining a lot of ideas about reincarnation that we have today, and some of the debates around reincarnation and around Druze identity in the 20th century by looking at a kind of corpus of literature. And many of these people that I'll bring up are very near and dear to the ADS. Some of them we might know personally. So that's the first part of my presentation, which is more discursive about the role of the uninitiated in reformulating conceptions of reincarnation and Druze identity. The second half is related to the Civil War. I was going to focus on the case of Basil, primarily not because he's necessarily the most interesting case, although he's extremely interesting, but because of all of my cases, he is the one case that brings in something of the diaspora. Because he is a diasporic person, he grew up in Canada. He had his moment of nutuk very fascinatingly, not far from here at the statue of the three soldiers. And so I was going to talk about him, but I might switch, if you permit me, and talk about two other cases that are not having to do with the diaspora, but that do relate to the Civil War. That could be, since you've heard about Basil, more interesting. So anyway, I'm going to start now with the first part of my presentation. So I think it is clear for many Druze, especially for uninitiated Druze, that reincarnation is, or has become, the central pillar, one of the central, if not the central pillar, of their faith. It is the belief that is most commonly associated with the Druze, and it's something that almost any Druze, even those who know absolutely nothing about the faith, can point to as a defining characteristic of the religion. The question is, how did this come to be the case, and why? So in order to answer this question, I argue, we have to understand that during the 19th and 20th centuries, the Druze community was faced with a series of existential challenges. Indeed, because of the way the Druze community is structured, around the division between the initiated and the uninitiated, the social world of the Druze village, indeed the rhythms of village life, were and are, in my opinion, absolutely inseparable from experiences of Druze religiosity. So in a context of urbanization and then later emigration, it became very difficult for the uninitiated Druze, who are for the most part the ones moving to the city and or abroad, to understand, experience, pass their religion on to their children, or much less explain the religion to outsiders. And this is something that became more and more important in the 20th century. The lack of any kind of clear clergy structure, no book or series of books that would be the equivalent of the Quran or the Bible that could be understood or at least read by the layman, and the lack of any kind of specific building for prayer and congregation similar to a church or a mosque all compounds this situation. So the kind of crisis of modernity that all religions face is compounded in the case of the Druze. Simply put, the Druze don't have their Protestant moment. They don't have their moment of this individual relationship to the religion. It's always a group or social thing. So what happens in this case? So it is into this void, I would argue, that a group of uninitiated Druze step in, hoping to explain their faith in a manner that makes it both clear to the uninitiated and to others, as well as responsive to the demands of modernity and even science, as well as appropriate for the context of an increasingly globalized world. Now, as Yvonne Haddad, who wrote a magnificent chapter of her book about the history of the Druze in North America, as she writes in her book, which is kind of backing up what I'm saying, the Druze village life provided for the social, cultural, political, educational, economic, and religious life of the community. With modernization and urbanization, and I would add here globalization, changes on the periphery of the Druze sphere in Beirut, Damascus, and Amman have inevitably affected its center. So it is in this context, then, that we can understand, she continues, the interest of some members of the community in reforming the faith by making it relevant and meaningful for modern life and providing for a new kind of ijtihad, or individual interpretation, outside the land that the Druze have been in for a millennium. So, indeed, I would argue, in my opinion, that any attempt to explain the Druze faith by uninitiates or write about it is a form of renovation. Which is to say that attempts to understand the Druze faith inevitably function as reinterpretations of it, even if that was not their original intention. To understand what I mean, we can only think of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, the mere act of translating the Bible into German entailed a reformation of what Christianity meant, even if the initial Protestants saw themselves as true Christians or original Christians. And in their pulling out from the rituals of the Catholic Church. So in all of these processes, what Druze say about reincarnation, and just as importantly, the intellectual, philosophical, and spiritual contexts in which they place reincarnation become absolutely key. So I think reincarnation is the central mechanism through which this reformation of the Druze identity takes place in the 20th century. Indeed, it is precisely within this historical context that I believe reincarnation moves from being a folk belief and one with an arguably marginal role in the sacred scriptures, but we can debate that, into becoming in many ways the central tenet of the faith, and something that connects or reinscribes the Druze faith into other philosophical and spiritual traditions. I think the reason for this is severalfold. For one, reincarnation is at least seemingly easily comprehensible in its broad strokes, while many other Druze beliefs are difficult to explain, and in many ways incomprehensible for those without a strong background in Islamic or at least Ismaili philosophy. Another important point is that reincarnation is something that is locally distinct but globally shared, right? So it serves to emphasize a kind of Druze particularism vis-a-vis their Muslim and Christian neighbors, while at the same time connecting them to other faith traditions, particularly non-Abrahamic ones. The modern connections forged between the Druze and Hinduism and Buddhism through reincarnation is mirrored in the efforts of Kamal Jumblat, for example, who was, of course, an adherent of the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism and attempted to build relationships between the Druze and Hindus through his many trips to India, or at least between the religions. So it is also something that connects, very interesting, the Druze to Europe, albeit through the door of modernity and modern philosophical discourse. And in this way, it's different from the connection built between Christians in Europe, which is through religion, right? Particularly I'm thinking of the Maronites. So most importantly, I would argue, but more important than all of that, I would argue, is that in an age where empirical truth has been elevated to the status of ultimate truth, and where religion attempts to make claims on scientific or at least empirical truth in order to be accepted as real, the alluring and seductive idea that reincarnation is somehow, through the experiences of those who remember their past lives, always on the cusp of being proven scientifically, this aspect, the seductive capacity, becomes a real part of its appeal. Because in the 20th century and in the modern age, the idea that if you can prove something empirically, that something needs to be proven empirically in order to be considered real, right? That wasn't always the case. If you go back to the Middle Ages, before the scientific revolution, the meaning of truth was very different. In the modern age, empirical truth becomes ultimate truth. And the fact that there is this idea within reincarnation that it can be proven, right? Especially through the experiences of the Nat'in. There is no way to prove, for example, that Jesus was the Son of God. There is no way to prove, for example, that the Quran is the Word of God. These things need to be taken on faith. But there's this idea within reincarnation that you can prove it. The provability, or the allure of its provability, becomes an important part of its appeal. Because there's an idea that if you can prove reincarnation, you can prove somehow that the Druze faith is real too, since that's part of what they believe. So I would then argue that the Druze diaspora, to bring it back to the diaspora, and the North American diaspora in particular, has acted as a kind of social laboratory where a lot of these new ideas about the Druze religion were expressed, elaborated upon, and developed, primarily in the beginning out of necessity of preserving a sense of the religion for a new generation, born thousands of miles from the homeland. But I think as time has gone on, it has moved from that and become a bit more radical and really openly reformist. So we can begin, I think, the case of Abdallah Najjar is extremely instructive in this regard. Ambassador Abdallah Najjar is someone who has been at the forefront of attempting to transmit Druze knowledge to a generation of non-initiates. He created the Korah Council in 1970, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, was the first organization created to provide religious instruction outside the purview of the religious establishment, i.e. the initiated. He helped initiate the magazine Our Heritage, which spoke about Druze religious and cultural issues, and which, by the way, featured an article by Ian Stevenson in its 1980. Oh, I should say, I was talking before about the empirical provability of reincarnation. Well, the big proof, not of reincarnation, but of its alluring capacity, is that scholars like Ian Stevenson and Elandor Haraldson and Guy-Leon Playfair have spent their entire lives collecting thousands of reincarnation cases around the world, attempting to prove that it is scientifically real. So their work has become also a big part of is in my opinion, the ultimate demonstration of this allure or seduction of empirical verifiability that exists within reincarnation narratives. And so an article that Ian Stevenson published in a 1983 issue of Our Heritage was actually one of the most successful articles in that magazine, and the reasons for that are obvious. I could go on, but perhaps what Ambassador Najjar is best known for is his book, Madhhab al-Druze wal-Tawhid, published in 1965 and translated into English as The Druzes by Fred Macy in 1973. The book was extremely controversial when it was first, as it was the first book written about the Druze by a non-initiate. So it's not even that it was an outsider who wrote it, was that it was a non-initiate that made it controversial, and the fact that in the book he quotes from the Kitab al-Hakmi. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in this book, which is the first book written for the layman about the Druze faith, that the longest chapter in the book, by far, is the chapter about reincarnation. And I think reading just the first paragraph of that chapter in its English translation is extremely instructive. So I'll do that right now. Thank you. Belief in reincarnation, this is from Abdallah Najjar, goes back to ancient Egypt. The Egyptians knew it and toyed with it. Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher, proclaimed it, and Buddha made it the cornerstone of his religious edifice. Plato thought that the passage of souls through successive earthly lives may explain the progressive rise in the level of human intelligence and knowledge. Perhaps he meant that the growing increments in human progress are due more to progress in basic human intelligence by the hereditary process than by advances in education, science, technology, and library content. That this hereditary gain was affected by the soul holding this gain as it transits upon death from one body to the next. Nietzsche believed that that what happens now has happened an incalculable number of times before and will continue to happen into the future without change. This is an Indian theory older than the Greeks. It contends that creator and created tend to coalesce every 100,000 years only to begin once more another round of identical existence. The Druze added that all these happenings are marked by uninterrupted rise in spiritual value tied to a lodestar of divine will and destiny. So what we see here are many of the tropes that have come to define much of non-initiated discourse about reincarnation. As we can see, belief in reincarnation is presented as something universal, connected to modern philosophy, including Nietzsche, Kant, Goethe and Pascal are mentioned as well, and also that's something that connects them to Hinduism and Buddhism as well as ancient Egyptian philosophy. A tentative connection is even forged with Western science by asserting a link between genetic evolution on the one hand and the kind of spiritual ascension of souls that Najjar claims is hinted at both by Druze scripture and the works of Plato. Now, it must be said that, judged by later works, Abdullah Najjar does remain relatively conservative in his text. He does stick closely to Druze dogma. He adheres, for example, to the commonly held notion evinced in Druze scripture that remembrance of previous lives is impossible. And so this is something that other Druze writers coming after him don't necessarily do, actually. So many of the ideas dealt with here in just these 2 paragraphs and in the chapter receive book-length treatment in a series of entire books written about reincarnation by non-initiates, usually in Arabic, that begin to come out in the 80s and 90s. All in all, I see Abdullah Najjar, Ambassador Najjar, and the works of others coming after him as forming, but also being formed by, a series of ideas that start becoming popular within certain Druze milieus, formed in large part by the experiences of the diaspora, as well as the influence of Western education, particularly Protestant schools in Mount Lebanon. I broadly refer to this generation of uninitiated thinkers whose works did formulate, but also served to crystallize ideas that were already floating around among the uninitiated as a generation of kind of, and this is in conversations with a friend of mine, Wissam Nuwayhid, who I should also credit here because this idea came in conversations we had together, as a kind of generation of almost neo-Druze scholars, right? So some of these scholars, like Ambassador Najjar, sought merely to explain the faith to non-initiates, while others, like Anis Obeid and Adnan Kasamani, have actually sought to adapt or reform the Druze tradition. And then others, writing in Arabic, like Muhammad Khalil Basha or Said Imlab, who's the brother of the famous painter Jamil Imlab, have dedicated entire books to the subject of reincarnation, and they use it and its presence within the Druze religion as a springboard to discuss various different ideas about life and spirituality, including even their own. So though I don't claim that these scholars constitute a coherent school of thought, one can observe a series of similarities across this generation of writers and thinkers, including the fact that they are all from Mount Lebanon, born during the interwar period, maintain a very strong relationship to and with the diaspora. And finally, although they write about religion and philosophy, they are neither sheikhs nor experts in philosophy or religion. And that's why I would not include Sami Makarem in this group, because to me, he's a standard academic. Although his position is complicated. So they're these kind of amateur scholars or amateur philosophers, very much in the vein of Khalil Gibran, actually, or Mikhail Noaima. So in my opinion, I think those 2 towering figures of the Lebanese diaspora are kind of a model for these types of thinkers. Right. So to return to the beginning, so I don't have to talk about the Civil War part because the first part of my thing, so the Basel part became irrelevant, thankfully, because I've spent my whole time on this. So I'll briefly, anyway. So to return to the beginning, what is happening here, in my opinion, is a process similar to what the anthropologist Gregory Starrett, in his book, Putting Islam to Work, has referred to as objectivization, which in his context, he was studying contemporary Cairo, he talked about the growing consciousness on the part of Muslims that Islam as a coherent system of practices and beliefs, rather than an unexamined and unexaminable way of life. And I think that's what happens here, is a transfer of Druzeism from an unexamined and unexaminable way of life or spiritual tradition into a coherent, attempted coherent system of beliefs like a classical religion. And it's in this context that reincarnation acquires its importance. So that's basically the first part. And although I talk about people who emphasize reincarnation, we can also map different tendencies within the initiated by whether or not they marginalize reincarnation. So for example, there are many people within the initiated community who would try to portray the Druze as being nothing other than merely a school within Islam, and they will go out of their way to marginalize reincarnation. So in the same way that the uninitiated might go out of their way, these scholars, to emphasize or centralize reincarnation, there are also attempts in the opposite direction to kind of almost pretend that the Druze don't believe in reincarnation, as a way of kind of emphasizing a more Islamic identity. So that's why I do believe that debates about reincarnation are actually debates about something a lot larger, and they can be read as such. Now, I had the second half of that's the first half. Second half of my presentation was about the Civil War and about my third axis, which is actually what most of my research is about. And I had used the case of Basel because he's a diasporic person. So since I don't have too much time to go into other cases, I'm going to continue talking about Basel, but I'll make just a few kind of additions to what was previously said. So to me, I think it's very poetic that he had his moment of nutuk in front of the statue of the 3 servicemen, because what I understand, and I take ideas from Usama Mektasi here, I understand sectarianism in Lebanon to be a form of imagined community in the sense laid out by Benedict Anderson. So it's this idea of the interchangeability of people, this kind of flat, homogeneous citizenship achieved around a common thing that is shared, which is national identity. In Lebanon, it becomes religious identity, but it's a national imagination. It's not a religious imagination or a kinship imagination. And what is fascinating to me is that Basel looks at this statue that symbolizes the anonymity of American citizenship and American sacrifice, reaches within it and pulls out a Lebanese specificity that connects him to his homeland, allows him to adopt a critical gaze to his own party. And I think the work of Basel as a kind of an amateur researcher is made possible because he combines two archetypes, which are seen as opposite. One is the archetype of the martyr, and the other is the archetype of the diaspora. The diaspora, actually, let me, and then I'll end. Okay, so, it's fascinating is that the investigating research and indeed is permitted because of this status, okay. Indeed, what I think the unique and controversial work that Basel has done here is made possible by the combining of two unique and seemingly opposite archetypes. The archetype of the diaspora and that of the martyr. The archetype of the diasporic Lebanese, the diasporic Druze, is usually seen as someone whose kind of strength, indeed, lies in the fact that he is an outsider, whereas the martyr is seen as the most embedded in the community, someone poor of the very earth itself, and indeed so much a part of the community that he lost his life within it. So it's B's presence as a member of the diaspora that gives him the critical distance necessary in order to investigate the PSP and the Civil War, and allows him the kind of curiosity and fascination that would make such an endeavor desirable in the first place, but it is his status as a martyr that gives him the necessary access to affect this kind of research and make it meaningful. And I think that's very important to keep in mind in analyzing his status. And it's something that connects him from being merely a martyr, but also something to do with the diaspora. I have many other cases that are extremely fascinating that we can speak about informally that have to do with memories of the Civil War, but since they don't involve the diaspora per se, and since my time is running out, I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, dear Malek. Before I open up the floor to people present in the room, I'd just like to remind people who are following us online that they can direct their questions to Coco's email. It's ct885@georgetown.edu. It's Charlie Tango 885. With this, I will open up the floor. We have exactly 15 minutes before we take a 15-minute break. And please let us keep this in a question form and try as much as possible as to focus on what was said, not the religious element, which we are not really equipped to deal with. تفضل. Please, إذا بتعمل معروف على الميكروفون.
Dr. Rasamny mentioned Kathy Stevenson. Her name is Kathy Jabir Stevenson. Jabir. Kathy Stevenson. Jabir.
No. I mentioned Ian Stevenson.
Ian. He's a...
Ian or Kathy Stevenson?
No.
Oh,
Ian.
sorry then. Okay.
No problem.
All right. Second thing, we as Druze were born and we know what nutq, what reincarnation.
Right.
But have you guys studied anything about other religion? I've seen on TV where they're not Druze, none, and they prove to them a lot of their memories. Do you have any relationship between them?
Sure. I would ask you to, you mentioned Stevenson. Ian Stevenson has done tremendous work with communities all over the world, particularly in Turkey, India, Sri Lanka, investigating literally thousands of cases of people who claim to remember their past lives. And I'm more interested in the culture of reincarnation, but he attempts to try to prove it empirically by coming up with tests and things like that to see if it's true or not. There are many cultures. I think most of his cases are in Sri Lanka, India, Lebanon, and Turkey. So I think it's popular. But there's also Amerindian cases, which is Native Americans, and Inuit cases of reincarnation. But they're a little bit harder to ascertain because they don't have the same social function. They could be animals. They could be people from other parts of the world, because what makes the Druze easier to investigate is that it's people from the community. And that makes, so there is reincarnation in other cases, but because it's not within the community, it's hard to validate. To the extent that I have done work with others, it has been with some Christians, actually in Lebanon, who have reincarnation experiences. Usually they're Christians who live in Druze communities. And also, of course, you have the Alawites, let's not forget, of which there is a small community in Lebanon. They also believe in reincarnation, although their reincarnation does include animals and plants, unlike the Druze.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add to that, other than a recommendation for 20 suggested cases of reincarnation by Ian Stevenson, is this kind of Western move towards a belief in reincarnation as a form of spiritualism. So past life regression therapy has become increasingly popular. Authors like Brian Weiss have become vastly popular. So even outside of notions of religion, into more of a spiritual knowledge or connection of people across time and space.
Just quickly, if anyone's interested in learning more about this, there's a very nice book called New Clothes for Old Souls, which was published by the Druze Heritage Foundation. But for some reason, they don't like to distribute it because it's somewhat controversial. It's by Gay Playfair, and there's a lot of what we call, and this is initially something that my late mentor Salibi wanted to do, there's a whole bunch of what we call Druze-like communities across the world. So when the Druze actually talk about China and they talk about Yemen, they're not really mistaken. They're Druze-like in the sense that they share a lot of socio-religious practices, but they're not Druze, basically. So please go ahead.
So I just want to start by saying that this was truly brilliant. You both are incredible scholars, and I am humbled to be learning from you both today.
Thank you.
My question actually comes from, Natalie, you cited Avery Gordon and Ghostly Matters, and part of your quote from Gordon was, "It has a real presence." And what Gordon is really getting at is the hauntings that happen between these socio-political structures, right, that have a real impact on day-to-day lives of people and communities. So with that kind of in mind as like the framing point, Malek, you said something about how reincarnation structures communal memory.
Yes.
And Natalie, you were talking about how reincarnation forges necessary interconnections. So I'm interested in how you all are both conceptualizing reincarnation within our community as something that does have a real presence and also has these notions of hauntings, right? Like these hauntings that kind of follow us across time and space and lives, right? So I'm just wondering if you all could maybe speak to or ruminate on what the implications of that might be for the community, and especially on a cultural level, right? Because, you know, myself, like you both, like we do focus on the community and the cultural rather than the religious. So I'm just interested in what kind of a trajectory you see that, you see for our community for that reason.
I think just to kick us off on this, the idea of reincarnation in terms of the Druze often turns into this debate as to whether or not reincarnation is real or not and how we can prove it. And that type of like imperialist mode of inquiry is not what I'm interested in. I'm rather interested in the effects or implications of a belief in reincarnation for Druze people. I think the reason that we both often turn to the Lebanese Civil War is because when we're talking about traumatic experience, this is one of the most contemporary events of traumatic experience for Lebanese Druze reincarnated. I've also spoken to so many reincarnated people who have memories from the war, having died in bombs or explosions or shootings or the like. So the implications of this are thus political, they are social, and they're deeply personal. So the ways that I've been so fascinated by the ways that we kind of trace reincarnation stories. So this person is having these types of memories, and this story travels, and then the village, 2 villages over, somebody hears this story and thinks, oh, that could be my brother from a past life who has died. And there's a healing component to this. There's a bereavement process that gets enacted in the fact that our dead do not truly die. They go on to live past lives, and perhaps we can reconnect in that afterlife. So I think that that's critically important to note too, outside of proving reincarnation.
Malek, go ahead.
Yeah. I would add what's, I think, interesting about this whole idea of proving or not proving. It's often assumed that proving that the regimes of empiricism are something placed by outsiders onto reincarnation narratives, but they're actually a part of the ritual itself, which is interesting. So it's a kind of, it's a unique ritual because it's a ritual that includes empiricism in it. Because in order to be accepted, you have to prove the reincarnation narrative in a way. I mean, sometimes it can be taken on faith, sometimes it's a feeling, but oftentimes it can be a corpus of things, like usually it has to do with photographs, identifying family secrets, where things are buried, money. So there's almost like a kind of a canon of tests that come back and forth that are part of the ritual. So it's this interesting thing whereas most rituals are faith-based, this is a ritual that incorporates within its hegemony empiricism, but it's the ritual that dominates, not the empirical. The empirical is an instrument of the ritual, which I think is interesting. Number two is you were speaking about the idea of healing and the idea of structuring communal memory. And yes, I do think it can be healing, but can also be quite painful. And I think oftentimes reincarnation can have effects that are unintended. So for example, there's a common idea that reincarnation enforces sectarian identity because Druze come back as Druze. And that's true a lot of the times, but not all the time. And one extremely interesting case that I dealt with was a guy who was killed in the massacre of Kefrmetta in 76 or whatever it was. I think, oh, it was 83?
82.
But there was another one in 77.
No.
In the Metin?
Salima,
Excuse me. Salima, not, yeah, sorry, I apologize. Excuse me, Salima.
There's a lot of them, so.
Yeah, but I meant, it was in the Metin, so I meant Salima. Yeah, I meant Salima. Muhim, he came back, and as a child, he raised the family in a way of the person who had died, the person who he believes he was. So because of this experience of spending so much time with the widow and the two children who lost their father, it subverted the image of the martyr. And he says, I regret what I did. It was foolish of me to abandon my wife and children to go fight in this war. And because of my experience of reincarnation, I felt the pain of children who lost their father, and I felt the pain of a wife who lost her husband. And these voices of women, voices of children, are usually marginalized in sectarian narratives of the war. But it's precisely through this reincarnation narrative that those voices found their way back in. Voices of women, voices of children, and voices of the dead themselves. And one thing that he talks about also, and it's common to a lot of the reincarnation narratives, is something that is part of the communal memory but not part of the narrative, which is the experience of dying itself. Because a lot of people didn't die quickly. They bled to death, I have to be violent, they bled to death slowly because there wasn't proper medical attention. The hospitals weren't there weren't doctors on the field, and that's something that anybody who shared in the war is aware of, but it's not part of the narratives that we tell each other about the war, but it's something that comes with consistent detail in most of the Natin that I talk to, is vivid memories, extremely detailed memories of the process of dying itself. So that's one way that communal memory gets restructured.
So I'll take two more questions. I'll go with Dima first, please.
Thank you both for brilliant presentations. I was really thrilled. Just a question, two questions, small questions. Malek, you mentioned the Druze faith being provable through the provability of reincarnation.
Right.
I was wondering, does this make it like a universal thing? I mean, how do Druze consider or represent themselves the fact that this only happens in the Druze community? I mean, if this is in terms of provability, I mean, I'm trying to make it like, I mean, if this is a proof, I mean, how can we explain that it's not something universal and it doesn't happen everywhere in the world to other people? I mean, whether they have faith in other religions or not. This is my first question. The second question, I'm very much interested in the relation. You showed a picture, Natalie, you showed a picture of Basil with the father of the young PLA child,
Yusuf,
I would
yeah.
say Yusuf, that was killed. I mean, what is what is the link that is built between somebody who has reincarnated and the original family, and what happens then to the parents of Basil? I mean, what is is it the same as adopted children when they discover that they have been adopted? I mean, when they go and look for the the original or biological family. This is a little question that maybe has nothing to do with that, but I'm very much interested in how things, happen. And this creates actually some kind of a bond which goes beyond the family and links the whole community to each other. But does it go beyond the community as well? Thank you.
So quickly on the idea of it coming to reincarnation existing among other communities. I mean, reincarnation, according to the Druze dogma, is a human thing. It's just within the folk tradition, Druze tend to reincarnate into Druze because there's this idea that the Druze signed this initial contract and so on. But reincarnation is a consistent human, is a consistent fact of human life in the Druze religion. I think how it's explained, which I think is actually a very legitimate explanation, is that other communities are simply not open to the idea of reincarnation. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about the children aspect, because most of the times the moment of nutuk, the moment of remembering your past life, has to do with children. And what it implies a kind of attention to children that other cultures don't evince. So if a child, for example, says, oh, I like that house, okay, we'll keep moving. Druze might be like, all right, stop the car. You know, why? So that kind of, so it's that kind of thing that allows reincarnation narratives to be kind of built up within the community or cultivated.
Yes, and to add to that, I mean, I think the Malek, you used the term imagined community is very essential here, because these are bonds and intimacies and kinships that exceed the biological. So when there are, first of all, there are many families that do not encourage their children to speak about these reincarnation stories, actively work towards silencing them, because these stories are traumatic, can be very painful, and because they don't want to confuse a child and later an adult about relationships, familial bonds with different families in different villages or even in different nations sometimes. So there are some people who are just not encouraged to speak at all. There are others who they do this active search and often verification process of this person was a part of my past life family and form very real relationships and bonds with their past life families that in some ways are as intimate or even more intimate than the relationships that they have with their biological families in these present lives. So I mean, for example, I know somebody who every single weekend he travels to his family's house in the Jebel, his past life family's house, and sleeps there and acts as father and also friend to his children who are now his age. So that's very kind of situation dependent, and it does come with a lot of controversy in terms of dealing with traumatic experience and also this in-betweenness of families and relationships.
I'll take two quick questions and two quick answers, one, and we have to conclude almost immediately. Please go ahead and be quick about it, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my question is very quick. In your opinion, what does the idea of reincarnation lack in order to be a scientific theory? What does it lack, if it does lack anything? Thank you.
Let's take another question, please. Yeah, تفضلي.
Thanks a lot for this. So really quick as well. Natalie, you spoke about the process of healing. Can you talk a little bit more if you've seen in your study healing towards other communities? When you've experienced a traumatic experience and you've been a victim, how does that healing translate towards the other non-Druze? And Malek, you spoke a lot about sort of the empirical proof that's been growing. I'm not looking for a proof here. I'm looking from your studies. How have you seen the work dealing with threats towards reincarnation? And by threats, I mean whenever there's a theory that you're trying to prove, you also have to disprove threats against it. One example would be population growth. One example would be Druze reincarnating within Druze. So from your work, has there been a discussion on that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, 30 seconds each, please.
Quickly, just to be clear, in case there was some confusion, I'm not alleging that reincarnation is empirically provable. I'm alleging that the allure that it could be empirically provable is a big part of its appeal. So that's an important distinction. I don't argue that it's empirically provable or that it's empirically unprovable. I avoid that point. The idea of the world remaining the same is actually something that's very interesting. It's debated in different ways. What's very interesting is that a lot of people try to find, okay, there's different passports or not accurate censuses or things like that. But what's very interesting is that I asked this question to many sheikhs, and it's interesting to note that the sheikhs in Deir Taifi, who have to kind of correspond with the government and represent the faith in front of other traditions, will attempt to find reasons. But if you speak to the Orthodox sheikhs, especially the higher spiritual ranking ones, they'll just say there's a mistake with the world, not with us. Which kind of sounds silly, but actually is quite interesting because they're not wasting time trying to find. It's like if you're looking for something, you're trying to embody the path, not debate the path. And that's the difference between modern tradition, which I think the Druze are contending with now, versus older ways of knowing, which is not basically based on debating the Druze tradition with Islam or with rationalism, but rather saying, this is already done. The question is, how do we live this in our lives, not have debates about whether or not it's true.
Please, Natalie.
In terms of healing across communities, particularly within the Lebanese context, there's so much in trauma studies that has been written about the importance of talking about traumatic experience. So one of the implications, I think, of reincarnation stories of traumatized Druze peoples is that they're talking about traumas that are otherwise silenced or invisibilized. You know, here, the broader amnesia, cultural and national amnesia surrounding the Lebanese civil war. But even today, the violences and traumas that Lebanese peoples and people living in Lebanon are experiencing on a day-to-day basis in a nation in which psychological health care, access to psychiatric services and physicians is pretty non-existent. So just talking and having conversations, breaking that silence and admitting there is something about or called mental health, I think is a huge step.
Wanted to add to that idea about trauma. There's a quote, I think it's Kathy Caruthers in her book, but then she's quoting, I think, Sigmund Freud, where he says that trauma is that which is inexpressible, that which can't be expressed. And I think it's interesting that discourse about trauma is made possible by children, young children, often those who are still learning how to speak. So it's amongst those who cannot fully speak yet in the sense of adult speech, who are the ones who are articulating the communal trauma, which is defined as trauma precisely because of its unspeakability.
Yeah.
Thank you. Join me all in thanking Malek and Natalie.